In writing about nature in an urban setting, Henry Lefebvre argues in his 1968 book, The Right to the City, that the modern city should include all of the qualities people seek in their recreational escapes outside of the city. However, he simultaneously suggests that the city itself should reflect the values of the natural world, while also admitting that human agency destroys nature by converting it into a commodified resource. This reduction of the natural world is echoed by Martin Heidegger's concept of enframing, by which he argues that modern technologies, including architecture, fundamentally transform our understanding of the natural world, obscuring its true nature and instead framing it through an anthropocentric lens, where it appears as a resource for human use. In a similar vein, Giorgio Agamben expands on Michel Foucault's theory of the apparatus, defining it as anything that in some way has the capacity to capture, orient, determine, intercept, model, control, or secure the gestures, behaviors, opinions, or discourses of living beings. Crucially, he identifies that every apparatus produces a particular subject with a subjective point of view through which the world seems unquestionably aligned with the actions afforded by the specific apparatus in question. Architecture, however, is a uniquely situated apparatus. Not only does the architect design urbanity, but the urban apparatus also directs the architect's choices, resulting in an effect that is not linear, but instead cyclical and self-reinforcing. As the apparatus primarily responsible for the establishment of anthropocentric space, architecture and the city seemingly normalize the exploitation of the natural world through enframing, while simultaneously orienting human agency toward the perpetuation of exploitative behaviors. These factors corrupt human design agency, complicating Lefebvre's original assumption that a new form of urbanity even could include the virtues of the natural world. To escape the cycle of detrimental human agency, a new urbanity must be formulated by architectural agents beyond humans, architectural entities whose presence might displace anthropocentric norms. Walter Benjamin describes the presence of objects through the aura, writing that the experience of the aura rests on the transposition of a response common in human relationships to the relationship between inanimate or natural objects and human beings. The person we look at, or who feels he is being looked at, looks at us in turn. To perceive the aura of an object we look at means to invest it with the ability to look at us in return. As called for by Jane Bennett in her book Vibrant Matter, autonomous auratic entities might serve to loosen our attachments to a figure of unitary self, and instead give more recognition to the impersonal forces circulating within and around us, thus reorienting our understanding of nature. This thesis is a speculative design exploration of these auratic, non-human agents, and a demonstration of how they might induce a new human subjectivity.
Climate change has significantly influenced modern architecture, with the focus primarily on passive design and adaptive reuse. These strategies aim to reduce environmental impact, and they often fail to address the root cause of climate crisis. Technology's persistent interjection into the modern human life has provided a social distortion in regards to human relationships to the environment. The degree to which technology extends our causality beyond understandable perception is obscured and continues to shroud environmental degradation from that causality. A key factor in the environmental crisis is the aesthetic perception of nature and how we have framed nature as a resource. Philosopher Martin Heidegger's concept of enframing describes how technological interventions in nature, such as dams or bridges, can distort our understanding of the environment. In both cases of this technology, our relationship with nature is one of objectification and resource optimization, rather than a meaningful interaction. This aesthetic distortion contributes to the broader environmental crisis. Bruno Latour's down-to-earth questions why people have become more engaged when defining their personal territory than when defending nature. This indicates that people are motivated to act when they feel personally invested in the issue. Aldo Leopold's The Land Ethic advocates for a shift in how humans perceive the relationship with nature, urging us to view land as a community that includes all living and non-living elements. This perspective encourages a more responsible and ethical approach to the environment. Emotional connection to the environment to rectify our previous and current atrocities depends on the recalibration of our subjectivity and sensibility. In Dark Ecology, Timothy Morton explains that human technological advancements, while meant to solve environmental issues, have often exacerbated the very problems they sought to mitigate. Rather than relying solely on technological solutions, architecture should focus on guiding people towards action. Our increasing sense of distinction from the natural world, a byproduct of technologies, including architecture, has led to a loss of emotional attachment from the environment. This detachment extends to our relationship with the resources we depend on. People often have little awareness of where the materials for everyday products come from or the environmental damage caused by their production. By emphasizing the origin and environmental impact of these products, we can foster a deeper connection to the planet and encourage sustainable practices. This idea aligns with Deepesh Chakrabarty's notion of planetary subjectivity, which advocates for a broader understanding of how individual actions affect the global ecosystem. Intentional architecture can help bridge this gap by using natural materials and creating designs to foster emotional connections to both the built and natural environments. By encouraging empathy for the land and its resources, architecture can inspire people to take active roles in addressing climate change. Techniques to accomplish this reframing of perspectives include creating a categorical confusion between human and non-human objects and context. Ultimately, the question remains of why do we need convincing to help the environment? As Latour suggests, a key lies in re-entangling humans to the planet and causing a realization of the urgency of the situation. A new subjectivity would recognize the limits to our perception and cause a humility about our actions, replacing arrogant confidence and abusive behaviors with doubt and carefulness.
Humans perceive time in dichotomous modes. One of these dichotomies is that of linear time and cyclical time. Time is broken up chronologically, divided into past, present, and future. Though it is linear, timekeeping methods are repetitive. They repeat in cycles, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours in a day, so on and so forth. Another related dichotomy is that of quantitative versus qualitative time. The former is grounding time within lived experience, and the latter renders time this kind of unit of measurement that is decoupled from any sort of lived spatial experience. All of the terms building and architecture are used interchangeably by laymen and even those within the design profession. This thesis argues that that conflation is fundamentally incorrect. This goes back to an idea of qualitative versus quantitative time, and thus this idea of timelessness versus timefulness. As sociologist Anthony Giddens has argued, this, quote, emptying of time is a large preconditioning for the idea of an emptying of space. This emptying of time, through its transformation from a qualitative experience to an abstract quantitative measurement, is fundamental for understanding architecture as being ontologically different from the building object. The timelessness of the latter requires, quote, the emptying of time from its lived experiences, while the timefulness of the former acknowledges the kind of complex qualitative lived experience. The apparent timelessness of a building and its ontological distinction from timeful architecture derives from the suppression of the experience of the present in favor of the idea of the continuum of the past and future. One of the key strategies used to achieve this is the architectural program, which replaces the description of all individuals and their idiosyncratic activities and experiences with their abstraction into generic users in reference to an undifferentiated and unchanging programmatic definition. This programmatic definition of space places all actions and experiences on a continuum with all past and future instances, which then obscures all variations or deviances from that programmatic norm. As Henri Lefebvre from The Production of Space argues, with the advent of modernity, time has vanished from the social space. It is recorded solely on measuring instruments, on clocks that are as isolated and functionally specialized as this time itself. Lived time loses its form and its social interest. Timeless architecture may paradoxically present itself as being derived from this continuum of past and future, while simultaneously erasing any sort of remnants of lived time and individual experiences. Consequently, instead of this problematic architecture of continuum, this thesis seeks an alternative approach, one that will be called an architecture of experiences. This architecture of experiences is grounded in a qualitative understanding of time, one that is a timeful architecture. By encouraging a shift in architectural practices and discourses towards this framework of an architecture of experiences, it acknowledges the complex interplay of the non-universality of lived time in contrast to objective measured time. This thesis will demonstrate this architecture of experiences through a combination of heterogeneous programmatic typologies, which allow for a number of idiosyncratic activities and interactions.
In our Rehuman Notes on Archaeology of Design, theorists Beatrice Colomina and Mark Wigley propose the idea that the history of architecture is a history of the human body under siege by its own inventions, presenting the idea that the environments that humans create have unintended consequences that challenge our survival and well-being. They argue that design is a form that is constantly changing and reshaping the way it means to be human or what it means to survive, presenting the idea that humans are the only species that have systemically designed their own extinction. As reality of the climate emergency becomes more apparent, a radical transformation is taking place in our attempts to mitigate the environmental issues that we are currently facing. Theorist Lucas Lukavkan's assertion that the planet is not just a backdrop to human activity, but an active participant in shaping of existence, highlights the misconception held by much of humanity that the Earth does not exist solely for our benefit. Lukavkan explores the idea that this crisis is not a planetary one, rather a human one that threatens the human technosphere, reflecting a broader misunderstanding of our role of the natural world and the boundaries between the built environment and the ecosystem. Although humanity possesses knowledge of their detrimental actions, their inability to care about the issue is driven by the instrumentality of human technology. The reliance on technology, primarily developed to enhance human comfort and convenience, has distorted this. Through his concept of end-framing, philosopher Martin Heidegger illustrates how technology causes environmental elements to appear as resources for exploitation for human needs, in seemingly accordance with the technology that was designed to harvest it. Technology has distorted our perception of the natural world, rendering it an object of human will, a resource to be exploited. This instrumentalization of nature complicates our relationship with the environment, leading us to view it as external rather as something continuous with our existence. Giorgio Agamben expands on Michel Foucault's idea of the apparatus, described as human constructs that transform humans and direct their actions, producing its own subject by producing norms, desires, behaviors. These subjects are linked to ideas of anthropocentrism, individualism, techno-optimism, and unwillingness to examine the flawed premises. This subjectivity is the driving force behind humanity's progression towards extinction. Technology, as Heidegger suggests, is not just a neutral tool, but an extension of our practical engagement with the world, integrated into our actions. This unreflective use blinds us to their broader implications, turning them into instruments of self-designed extinction. Theorist Dipesh Chakrabarty calls for a new form of subjectivity rooted in a planetary sensibility in which we must cultivate a collective awareness that transcends away from individualism. This post-anthropocentric subject recognizes its interconnectedness with both human and non-human entities, while maintaining a critical awareness of technology's environmental impacts. While architecture has traditionally functioned as an apparatus designed to secure humanity's anthropocentric space, it is distinct in its potential to be recalibrated to foster alternative forms of subjectivity. Architecture has a potential to reprogram this relationship of fostering a new sensibility that encourages awareness of our entanglement with the ecosystem. Such a shift could catalyze a transition from exploitation to stewardship. This thesis will demonstrate a recalibrated architecture striving for a cultivation of a planetary subjectivity by reimagining it as an uncanny form of technology capable of new performances. This awareness will lead to a more integrated approach where the built environment actively participates in cultivating a new planetary subjectivity rather than merely serving human needs.
Architecture is far from being an autonomous medium. It is an apparatus precisely intertwined with its surrounding in terms of the social, intellectual, and sensory dimensions of human experience. The modern dominance of visual for architecture demonstrates or fosters a fermented subjectivity marked by distraction, technological distortions, and sociopolitical alienation. During Martin Heidegger's concept of inframing and the critique of technological mediation, this thesis argues that contemporary architecture, over reliance on visual dominance, transforms architecture into nothing else but a mere experience and mere objects of categorization and control. By prioritizing vision, architecture aligns with the reductive tendencies of technology, embracing architecture as something to be seen rather than experienced. In so doing, it acts as an apparatus that reinforces the human perception of the world that is responsible for the Anthropocene. Giorgio Agamben, expanding on Michael Foucault's original concept of apparatus, defines it as anything that has in some way the capacity to capture, orient, determine, intercept, model, control, or secure the gestures, behaviors, or opinions that discourses are happening on living beings. In this way, he articulates that each apparatus produces its own unique subject, transforming human interaction from passive interactions to active, embodied curiosity. By integrating sensory modalities such as touch, sound, and scent, architecture can challenge the inframing tendencies done by technology. This approach is not simply about augmenting sensory diversity, but it is about cultivating a form of subjectivity rooted in embodied awareness, curiosity, and collective responsibility. This thesis will produce a new form of architectural experience by expanding the dimensions of architectural sensation, integrating multisensory engagement. This is happening to adaptable spatial systems and the integration of the nature itself in the architecture. Some of these elements are happening through strategies in the building, like connecting sound with vision, thermal perception, and dynamic natural elements taken into consideration in the building. Aim to transcend traditional boundaries, redefining architecture as a medium for connection between individuals and their surrounding environment. The architectural spaces envisioned will provoke reflection through sensory experiences. This idea will be demonstrated in an embodied compass happening in between Yorba Buena Island and Treasure Island in San Francisco, California. A context that provides very unique challenges in the site, considering natural elements like wind and sea level rise. The environmental hyper objects happening all around the city. This adaptive multisensory approach works as a bridge between the natural environment and our planetary system, offering an embodied critique of visual bias while cultivating other sensory and ethical engagement with our environments. By addressing Heidegger's critique of inframing theory through this design strategies that also incorporates Johanni Spala's advocacy for multisensory architecture and Oliver Eliassen's proposal to incorporate awareness and curiosities into design, it positions architecture as a medium for transforming human engagement with the world, shaping not just spaces but the way we inhabit them.
Contemporary practice has primarily positioned environmental forces and climate as an object to be reckoned with. Diurnal temperature swings are to be thermally controlled. Rain is something to be shed, not welcomed. Wind may be invited inside only when warranted. Architecture functions as a tool of separating an interior environment from an exterior one. This act of boundary making is implicated within the broader context of humanity's removal from nature. Throughout written history, nature has been a term with multiplicity and depended on culture, era, and individual. Deep ecologist Neil Everden has articulated how the changing concept of nature acts as a register for humanity's changing relationship with the environment. As people grew to believe they had control over environmental forces, the definition of nature changed to that of an object from which humans are excluded. The progression of architectural development, colonialism, and industrialization saw a widening split between humans and nature. Unlike picturesque images of docile nature, humans today find themselves confronted by the hyper-object known as climate change. The term hyper-object, coined by Timothy Morton, refers to an entity whose existence transcends the spatial and temporal dimensions which are perceptible to humans. By identifying climate change as a hyper-object, Morton effectively notes the obscurity of humanity's entanglement with nature. With the current Anthropocene era, in which humans are confronted with their ability to significantly alter the planet's climatic and geological conditions, a new definition of nature is necessary. The issue of revealing becomes an aesthetic problem which technology reinforces. As Martin Heidegger discusses, modern technology objectifies nature to the level of human resources, therefore making a conceptual rift between humans and the environment appear to be a fundamental truth rather than an arbitrary choice. Although architecture, as a technology of shelter and environmental insulation, is instrumental in the maintenance of this problematic framework, an alternative architecture has the capacity to provide new understandings. The philosopher Jacques Rancière argued that societal change necessitates a new aesthetic which can disrupt the sensible and possibly corroborate the action undertaken by political subjects to reconfigure what are given to be facts. Modern technology poses a distinction from nature as fact. Architecture can adopt new aesthetic relationships with nature and reconfigure the apparent separation between humans and the environment. An architecture which is responsive and welcoming to shifting environmental forces can act as a new conceptual and perceptual framework through which humanity understands its fundamental entanglement with nature. In re-examining architecture's role, the question of its inherent purpose becomes relevant. Tracing back the millennia of building history leads to an unknown genesis. For centuries, theorists have filled this blank as a rhetorical tool for the sake of arguments. In particular, Marc-Antoine Lagier uses the image of a primitive hut as a fictitious beginning for his arguments about architectural design. The narrative describes how harsh sunlight, dense clouds, a rainstorm, and diurnal temperature differences lead humans to create architecture as a means of insulating and defending against the environment's inherent variability. Although Lagier uses this premise for an argument of the tectonics of architecture, he unintentionally posits an alternative implication. Architecture reflects humanity's conception of and relation to the environment. Centuries later, Rainer Banham recognized this framework in his essay, A Home is Not a House. In considering an alternative premise for architecture, Banham compares two methods in which humans relate to environmental forces, one of which is to avoid circumstances and the other to interfere. A simple campfire is described for the latter situation, depicting how fire's effects of heat and light create spatial dimensions within the greater outdoors. Banham writes, unlike the living space trapped with our forebears under a rock or roof, the space around a campfire has many unique qualities which architecture cannot hope to equal. Above all, its freedom and variability. The campfire is not an inert material acting as background, but it is alive with heat, illumination, smoke, sparks, and motion. Users can move through the gradient of spatial and experiential qualities according to desired effect. The campfire is an architectural typology which includes the outdoors rather than excludes.
Climate change and living within ecological boundaries are the prevailing challenges of our generation. And because architecture is a material manifestation of social ideas and practices, it must hold those two ideas simultaneously. So both addressing both immediate ecological harm and also the root causes of that harm, which are ultimately social. Architecture also inherently operates at a unique timescale, so it must situate its actions in a temporal context that extends beyond immediate effects and then goes on to encompass its future impacts, including those that are entangled with social connection to environmental harm. American residential urbanism becomes the site for architectural intervention to shift societal ways of life towards a relationship of mutual care with the living environment. Narratives of American nationalism and the paradigms of residential urban development that they support have created an infrastructure for daily life patterns that encourage dependence on fossil fuels and discourage place connection. Elisa Iturbe identifies that when the built environment adapted to the introduction of fossil fuels, it became a force that reinforces daily patterns of life relying on those fuels, creating an American fabric of carbon form. As argued by Elizabeth Carlson Manthara, in addition to building this world of carbon form, colonialism has actually intentionally built systems that discourage forming deep place connections. So Anthony Giddens terms this process disembedding and argues that it's a hallmark of modernity that continues to this day. Carbon form and disembedding processes reinforce one another, and both stem from colonialism and capitalism's tenet of extraction for production. In this way, present American residential urbanism is trapped in carbon form and environments of disembedding. Carbon form and disembedding are phenomena that describe the removal of individuals and practices from social and temporal contexts, and are associated with the decontextualized production of goods enforced by capitalism and modernism. In contrast, Bruno Latour defines the process of engendering as an alternative form of production that is situated in spatial and temporal contexts, focuses attention on contributions to present and future generations, and that creates a holistic well-being and life enrichment. The architectural application of this concept introduces the possibility of architectural form that actively encourages place entanglement and the deconstruction of carbon form through its social appropriation, the creation of an architecture of engendering. Increasing local agency over the built environment creates more opportunities for architectural engendering. In addition to physical agency, local place narrative agency is vital. By designing space for a multiplicity of plural place narratives, architecture can engage in creating the heterogeneous community identified by Giorgio Agamben and as well as Michael Hart and Antonio Negri. This heterogeneous community, supported through an architecture of plural place narratives, works against the rigidity of the current capitalist fabric and validates individuals' belonging and placemaking, encouraging local agency, place entanglement, and the appropriation of urban form. Architecture can create space for a multiplicity of place narratives by shifting the patterns of daily life. Michel de Certeau argues that through enacting small moments of agency in daily life, individuals can make meaning even within the context of modernity. These small moments of agency are opportunities to shift daily routines into meaningful performances, to transform them into everyday rituals. Modernity and capitalism force individuals to engage in routinized actions that lack inherent meaning. These routines serve to disembed individuals from place by pressuring the sites of daily routines to obey the same logics as sites of capitalist production. In contrast, everyday ritual can be defined as an action that transforms an individual's interactions with daily repetition through shifting attention to the act in and of itself, creating embodied presence, and imbuing the act with inherent meaning. This creates deep place grounding, embedding people in the places they live. An architecture that introduces excess affords individuals the opportunity to appropriate that excess for themselves, allowing the transformation of routinized actions into the meaningful performance of everyday rituals of diverse personal significance. The enactment of these everyday rituals made possible by this architecture of excess is the basis for grounding oneself in place and developing meaningful place narratives. Thus, an architecture of everyday ritual becomes a method of architectural engendering, a way to appropriate carbon form, create place entanglement, and encourage local agency.